It was past midnight on the frozen front lines of Belgium, January 1945. The snow had stopped falling hours ago, but the cold had deepened into something unbearable. The kind that seeps through wool, steel, and even courage. The men of the 331st Armored Division were stranded somewhere outside the town of Bastogne, their tanks lined up like silent monuments in a dead forest. The engines had frozen, the fuel lines were clogged, and the Germans were closing in from the north. 47 American soldiers, cold, exhausted, and out of communication with command, waited inside their immobile vehicles, knowing that if the tanks didn't move by dawn, they wouldn't make it out. In the middle of that line of metal in fear was a small, grease-stained figure working under the dim glow of a lantern. His name was Sergeant William Bill Morrison, a mechanic from Ohio. He wasn't a commander, a scientist, or a hero by title, just the man who fixed what others broke. But that night, he would make a decision that would save 47 lives, and break a rule so strict it could have ended his career and court-martialed him on the spot. Bill Morrison had joined the Army not because he loved war, but because he loved engines. As a boy, he had rebuilt his father's tractor with a hammer and a few bolts long before he learned to read a manual. By the time he was 20, he could identify an engine's problem just by listening to its hum, a gift that the Army needed badly when the war in Europe reached its peak. But even for him, the winter of '45 was brutal. The Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had turned the forests of Belgium into a frozen graveyard of tanks and trucks. Fuel froze, oil thickened, steel cracked like glass. The Army issued strict mechanical orders. Never tamper with fuel mixtures, never alter ignition systems, and under no circumstances never modify the starter solenoids, a rule written in red on every maintenance log. Bill had followed those rules every day of his service. Until that night. The men had been fighting for 72 hours without rest. Their Sherman tank platoon had been ordered to retreat to Bastogne, but the engines refused to start. The temperature had dropped to negative 25 degrees Celsius, and the diesel fuel had turned to wax. Bill and his assistant, Private Collins, had been under the tanks for hours, gawing pipes with blowtorches, replacing filters, and checking injectors. But nothing worked. The engines were dead, the radios silent, and the forest eerily quiet except for distant artillery. Inside the lead tank, Captain Reed was pacing, checking his watch. "Sergeant," he called out, "we're out of time. If those engines don't turn over, we're sitting ducks at sunrise." Bill didn't answer. He just stared at the tank's frozen starter, a small metal box bolted near the engine. He knew exactly what the problem was. The solenoid coils had seized from the cold, preventing the starter from drawing enough current to crank the engine. There was a way to bypass it, a trick he'd learned back home in Ohio fixing tractors in winter. It involved rerouting the current directly through a modified wire, a risky move that could overheat the system or cause an explosion. The Army's manual called it unauthorized electrical bridging. Illegal, dangerous, punishable by court-martial on the spot. But there were 47 men waiting, and every second the sound of enemy tanks grew louder through the trees. Bill turned to Collins, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "Private," he said quietly, "hand me the copper wire from the signal box." Collins hesitated. "Sir, that's not regulation." "I know," he replied, his eyes fixed on the tank. "Neither is dying here." He crawled beneath the engine, his hands trembling from the cold and fear. He stripped the insulation off the copper wire with his teeth and began wrapping it around the solenoid terminals. Carefully, methodically, whispering to himself like a prayer,
Above him, Captain Reed was shouting for updates. "Sergeant, what's happening down there?" "Just keep everyone inside, sir," Bill replied, tightening the last connection. "If this works, you'll hear it." He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and shouted, "Try it now!"
Then, with a roar that shook the snow off nearby trees, the Sherman's engine came to life. The sound was deafening, a growling mechanical heartbeat in the silence of death. Men cheered inside their tanks. The crew of the second and third vehicles scrambled to follow his lead. Bill shouted instructions: bypass the relay, use the copper from the signal box, wrap it tight. One by one, the engines turned over, coughing, sputtering, then roaring awake like beasts thawed from ice. 47 men, 6 tanks, all running again. Captain Reed climbed out of his hatch and stared at Bill, who was now covered in oil and frost. "What did you do?" he asked. Bill hesitated. "I fixed it," he said simply. Reed looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that weighed rules against survival. Then he nodded. "Good work, Sergeant. Let's move." Within minutes, the convoy was rolling toward Bastogne, engines rumbling through the snow. The men didn't know what Bill had done, only that they were alive because of it. But Bill knew the truth. What he'd done could get him stripped of rank, maybe worse. He hadn't followed orders. He'd broken the code that every mechanic swore by. Still, as the tanks pushed through the forest, their headlights slicing through the fog, Bill felt a strange calm. The sound of engines was like a hymn, the song of survival. Hours later, as dawn broke over the Belgian hills, the convoy reached friendly lines. The men were safe, the tanks intact. But the relief was short-lived. An inspection officer, Lieutenant Harris, approached with a clipboard. "We're checking all mechanical systems," he said. "Any unauthorized modifications?" Bill froze. He knew what that meant. The copper bypasses were still in place. If Harris found them, it would be over. He stood silently as the officer examined the tanks. The moment Harris lifted the engine hatch, Bill's heart pounded like a drum. The copper wire glinted faintly in the morning light. "What's this?" he muttered, frowning. "This isn't regulation wiring." Before Bill could answer, Captain Reed stepped forward. "That's part of a field repair," he said firmly, "authorized under my command." The officer paused. He looked from Reed to Bill, then back at his clipboard. "Field repair, huh? Fine, we'll file it under emergency procedure." He closed the hatch and walked away. Bill exhaled, his breath shaking in the cold. He looked at the captain. Reed gave him a half smile. "You broke the rules, Sergeant, but you saved 47 men. Don't ever write that down." Bill nodded. "Wasn't planning to, sir." That morning, the convoy rejoins the main division near Bastogne. Few ever knew what had happened that night, how one mechanic's illegal fix turned the tide for a handful of soldiers trapped in the snow. But among those 47 men, Bill Morrison became something of a legend, not for defying orders, but for choosing life over rules.
For the next 2 days, the men of the 33st Armored Division stayed near Bastogne, repairing their vehicles and resupplying before the next push east. The forest that had nearly become their grave was now a distant shadow, yet Bill Morrison couldn't shake what he'd done. Every time he opened a toolkit or touched a wire, he felt it, the weight of his decision. It hadn't been heroism, he told himself, just desperation. Still, something about the quiet respect the other soldiers gave him made the guilt heavier, not lighter. The story spread through camp faster than smoke. The mechanic who rewired death, some called him. The copper miracle, others joked. But Bill stayed silent. He didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to be forgotten, because legends attract questions, and questions could lead to court-martials. On the third morning, Captain Reed summoned him to a tent near the field HQ. Bill entered, wiping his hands on a rag, nervous as a child caught sneaking out of school. Reed was sitting behind a small wooden desk, reading a typed report. He looked up, his face unreadable. "You've been busy, Sergeant." Bill shifted uneasily. "Sir, if this is about the repair—" "It is," Reed interrupted softly. "Headquarters received my report. They want a full account of your method. The engineers think your field modification could be valuable." Bill blinked. "Valuable?" Reed nodded. "They've been trying to find ways to start cold engines faster. Your illegal fix, as you call it, did exactly that. In half the time. They're asking for your notes." Bill stared at the floor. "Sir, I didn't take notes. I wasn't thinking about science. I was just trying to keep everyone alive." Reed leaned back, a faint smile on his lips. "Sometimes, Sergeant, that's where the best inventions come from. Necessity." He stood up and walked closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm not going to lie for you if Command investigates, but I'll tell them the truth, that you did what you had to do. You saved lives, and that's what matters." Bill nodded quietly, his chest tight with a strange mix of relief and fear. "Thank you, sir." Reed placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't thank me yet. They might still want to question you." By the end of the week, a pair of Army engineers arrived from the Ordnance Department. They found Bill working under a Jeep and asked him to demonstrate the modification. In the bitter cold, he showed them the copper wire connection, explaining each step with careful precision. One of the engineers, a bespectacled man from Boston named Lieutenant Avery, listened intently, scribbling notes. "So you rerouted the current directly through the starter circuit, bypassing the solenoid?" Avery asked. "Yes, sir," he replied. "It's dangerous if you don't time it right, could burn the contacts or overload the coil, but if you keep the pulse short, it's enough to wake a frozen engine." His partner nodded. Simple, risky, but genius. Bill shrugged. "Desperation, sir, not genius." The two engineers exchanged a glance. "Well," Avery said, "desperation might have just given us a field solution. You may have broken the book, Sergeant, but you might have rewritten a page of it too."
Later that evening, after the engineers left, Bill sat alone outside the repair tent. The sky was pale gray, and flakes of snow drifted down silently. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had built, repaired, and sometimes destroyed. He thought about the faces of the 47 men he'd saved, the laughter that returned after days of silence, the way Collins had clapped him on the back after the engines roared to life. For the first time in weeks, he smiled, not because of pride, but because he realized something profound, that courage wasn't always about pulling a trigger or charging forward. Sometimes it was about taking a risk that no one would ever understand. 2 weeks later, as the Battle of the Bulge came to its end, Bill received an unexpected message. He was ordered to report to a forward command post outside Liège. When he arrived, he found a tent lined with officers, men with polished boots and serious eyes. At the center stood a colonel with a thin gray mustache and an engineer's insignia on his shoulder. "Sergeant Morrison," he said, motioning him forward, "we've heard quite a bit about you." Bill saluted, his voice steady. "Sir." The colonel opened a folder. "This illegal fix of yours, I've read the reports. You may have broken regulations, but your ingenuity prevented a disaster. The Army's mechanical division is adopting your method, with safety modifications, of course, for use in extreme cold weather conditions." Bill blinked. "Sir, you mean they're making it official?" The colonel smiled faintly. "With a few improvements, yes. We're calling it the Morrison bypass procedure, effective immediately for all armored units operating in sub-zero climates." For a moment, Bill was speechless. He wasn't sure if he should feel honored or terrified. "Sir, I never meant to—" The colonel raised a hand. "You meant to keep your men alive. That's enough." Then he did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "You remind us why wars are won not just by soldiers, but by problem solvers." Bill shook his hand, still dazed. That night, as he walked back to camp, snow crunching under his boots, Bill thought about how strange war could be. One week, you're a mechanic breaking rules to stay alive.
The next, those same rules are rewritten in your name. When he reached his tent, Collins was waiting, grinning ear to ear. "Heard the news, Sarge. The Morrison fix, it's in the manual now." Bill laughed softly. "Guess I'll have to teach it the proper way now." But then his voice turned thoughtful. "Just promise me one thing, Collins. Don't ever do it unless you have to. Rules exist for a reason. I just borrowed one for a night." Collins nodded, suddenly serious. "Understood, sir." The war ended months later. Bill returned to Ohio, back to the quiet hum of engines and farm roads. He never spoke much about what he'd done. When neighbors asked about the war, he'd just smile and say, "I fixed what was broken." He rebuilt tractors again, helped repair school buses, even taught local kids how to tune engines. The copper wire trick, the one that had once been illegal, was now standard knowledge among mechanics. Yet for Bill, it was never about recognition. It was about the night in the snow when the world felt frozen and hopeless, and a handful of men found life in the sound of an engine turning over. Years later, one of those soldiers, now an old man himself, visited Bill's grave. The inscription was simple: "William H. Morrison. He repaired what others couldn't." The veteran stood there in silence, remembering that night when the engines came alive and death retreated into the forest. He whispered softly, "You didn't just fix the tanks, Bill. You fixed us." And in the stillness of the wind, it almost felt like those engines were roaring again, somewhere beyond time, somewhere warm.
Decades passed, and the world moved on from the smoke and noise of war. The forests of Belgium grew peaceful again. Where once engines had roared and men had prayed, now only the wind whispered through the trees. In museums and history books, the Battle of the Bulge became a tale of strategy and endurance, of generals and divisions. But men like Sergeant William Morrison, the quiet hands behind the survival, rarely earned a line. Yet somewhere deep in the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, one entry remains, written in careful type. Morrison Bypass Procedure, developed under field conditions, January 1945. It doesn't mention fear or frostbite or the smell of burning oil. It doesn't tell of a young man praying under a tank, risking his life not for glory, but for others. It simply records the fact that a mechanic once found a way when there was none. If you walk through an old vehicle museum today, you might find one of those Shermans, preserved and gleaming, a relic of metal and memory. And if you listen closely, you can almost imagine it breathing, the hum of its engine, the vibration of life that Morrison coaxed out of it with a wire, a prayer, and courage. His story reminds us of something timeless, that history isn't written only by those who lead charges or win battles. It's written by those who, in moments of quiet desperation, refuse to give up. Because wars are fought with weapons, but they are survived through invention, through patience, and through faith that one small act of courage can ripple across time. William Morrison never saw himself as a hero. When asked years later why he took the risk, he simply said, "Machines don't save people. People save people. The machine just listens." Maybe that's why his legacy endures, not in parades or medals, but in every act of problem-solving under pressure, every field repair done to save a life rather than take one. In a world that often glorifies destruction, Morrison's story is about creation, about using skill and knowledge as shields against despair. As the camera fades over the quiet Belgian woods, the same place where cold once ruled and engines once froze, the narration softens, like a memory being put to rest. In every war, there are names we forget and a few we should never have. Not because they fought harder, but because they thought deeper. Because in a world built to break things, they chose to fix them. The snow falls again, gentle, endless, covering the ground where Sergeant Morrison once knelt beside a silent tank. And for a moment, it feels like the earth itself pauses to remember a man who broke a rule to keep hope alive.